There we go.
Are we live?
We are live.
You've got my best side.
Yeah, you look beautiful.
Perfect. Ladies, gentlemen, good morning. This is the second in a series of morning presentations and seminars that we're doing in various departments. We have a lot of people on Zoom, which is why we're starting this at 8:30, because those who couldn't be bothered to drag themselves out of bed are no doubt sitting in it with a bacon sandwich and a cup of coffee, listening all about repairing liabilities and leases. So the format is, I'm going to talk initially about repairing liabilities in a lease and how to limit that liability. And then Toby, who heads up dispute resolution, is going to have a pub quiz, except without the booze because it's too early in the morning and the bar's shut, on dilapidations per se. Now, I know a lot of people watching this are a combination of professionals, as in agents or surveyors, who might run industrial estates or who run property portfolios. Others are individuals who might own one or two commercial properties with a variety of lets. So I can't, in the time available, be all things to all people. So forgive me if what I'm going to say is something you already know, and forgive me also if what I'm going to say is not detailed enough for you, but you can always email me later or give me a call and ask any questions that you may have. So, my screen's on. Does that work? Yeah. So, first of all, repairing liabilities in commercial leases. Unlike residential property, tenants of commercial property are usually liable for pretty much everything which the building commands. Having said that, if it's not in the lease, the chances are that the landlord can't force the tenant to do anything that isn't already in there. So the first thing to look at when looking at a repairing liability is what sort of repairing liability do you have? In essence, there are two forms. You can either have an internal repairing liability or you can have a full repairing liability. An internal repairing liability would be an obligation to repair, maintain, look after, decorate internal surfaces, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, door furniture, that sort of thing. A full repairing liability, on the other hand, is exactly what it says. It is a liability for the tenant to be responsible not only for all the internal surfaces of the room that it's occupying or the building it's occupying, but also the main structure, the windows, the foundations, the roof, the plant and machinery which is in it. And this is quite often where the problem arises. If you are a tenant with a full repairing liability, you either have usually a building of a whole. So for example, this hotel we're sitting in, you might be leasing the whole building, in which case you are responsible yourself for dealing with everything to do with the running of it. If, however, you are occupying a part of it, this room, for example, in common with other tenants, then your liability as to repair is still full, even though it's only part of the building, but the landlord is obliged to repair and maintain the whole building and recover the cost of that by way of a service charge. And the service charge is usually worked out on a tenant's proportion pro rata to the room it occupies compared to the whole property. You need to be careful when you are a tenant, whether it is either an internal repair or a full repair, that you fully understand what your obligations to repair are. So, your repair provisions in a lease. Lawyers love taking everyday words: to repair, to keep, to maintain, etc. And having those words means something very different to that which they would do in normal parlance. So an obligation to keep a property in repair is an obligation, firstly, to put it into a decent state of repair and maintain that standard. It is an extremely onerous obligation on any tenant of any property. Quite often, a tenant's repairing liability is referred to in a lease as good and tenantable repair, or a good and substantial repair, or to well and maintain. It's been debated many, many times in case law. There isn't really an awful lot of difference between those expressions in terms of what it means to the tenant. The upshot is that the tenant is responsible for the full repairing liability of the property. It is onerous. It's much more onerous than a basic liability. Plant and machinery within premises is something which you also need to be wary of. It's very easy for a tenant to walk into a shiny new office building, rent one room or one story, and assume that because it's all brand new, everything is going to work out fine and the repairing liability isn't going to be too onerous. Well, that might well be the case, but also it might not. You're renting this room, for example. It's an internal repairing liability only. What else is the extent of your obligations? Well, it rather depends what's in the room. There's PowerPoint, the media, if there's heat extraction or air conditioning units, for example, which are peculiar just to this particular room, all of that is included in your repairing liability. So if you're taking on a lease of a building or part of a building, and the building is, say, 10 years old, all of that plant and machinery is still included in your repairing liability. It might well be that the room or the building you're having does not have plant and machinery which exclusively serves just that particular room or just that building. It might be supplying the whole industrial estate. You're still liable for it. If it's a full repairing liability in the lease, you're still on the hook for all of that. And the landlord recovers that for its service charges we talked about earlier. So what do you do? You've got a building which is 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old. You want to lease for 5 years. You are starting up your business perhaps, or moving to bigger premises, and you're not quite sure if the business is going to work or the business might expand. You might need different premises reasonably soon in the lease term. But your lawyer looks at the lease and says, well, this is a full repairing liability. The building's quite old. Are you really sure for the 5-year term that you're in it, you really want to have responsibility and a liability to continue to repair and maintain all aspects of it? The foundations, the walls, the floor, the roof space, aircon, lifts, winches, whatever it might be. So the tenant prudently would listen to its lawyer and say, no, I want my liability to be limited. How can you do that? Well, really, there's only 3 ways of doing that. You can exclude certain items of liability. If, for example, you're renting a warehouse and the winch equipment there is fairly old, you can exclude certain items of plant. Or you could have a cap on a service charge. So the building's old, the service charge might be £10,000 a year, and having ascertained the nature and extent of the likelihood of ongoing repairs to it, the tenant negotiates a cap on that service charge to say, right, okay, it's not going to be any more than £10,000 a year. Even if the boiler blows up and it's 25 grand to replace it, the landlord is going to be responsible for that, and my liability is only 10 grand. By far the most common way, however, is a schedule of condition. Now, a schedule of condition should be a series of photographs accompanied by a detailed narrative explaining what it is that you're looking at on the picture. And it is attached to the lease as evidence of the state of repair and condition of the property as at the time the lease commences. Now, a quick word of caution on schedules of condition. These things are now everyday use. If you're a teenager, it's life itself. If you're not a teenager, it's a means of communication and taking snapshots. These are the scourge of any surveyor or lawyer looking at a schedule of dilapidations in a lease. Because typically what happens is the tenant says, fine, I'm going to go and take a load of photographs and we're going to use that as a schedule of condition. We're going to stick it in the lease and that's all hunky-dory. It's perfectly obvious what it is. Well, actually it's not, because the moment you start taking a picture of a crack in the wall or a stained toilet basin or sink, or a boiler which has a bit of a leak in it, it's meaningless. It's meaningless unless it's accompanied by a proper detailed narrative and probably a survey of whatever it is you're looking at. In short, if you're a tenant and you're really relying on a schedule of condition to limit what could be tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds of liability, get it done properly. Put your hand in your pocket, pay a professional dilapidation surveyor to come and compile a proper schedule of condition. Drones. Get a drone up there, look at the roof. It's the biggest source of liability. How on earth could you possibly tell what the extent of roofing repairs might be simply by wandering around an office building? You can't. Maybe look at the drains, get cameras down there. Yes, all of this is a huge expenditure at the start of the lease term, which the tenant may or may not want. But if the entire object is to limit what could be a very expensive repairing liability later on, then it is well worth the expense. It is true, as I said earlier, that a landlord can oblige you to put the property into a good state of repair. However, as Toby will be talking about later, there are certain limitations to that. In short, a landlord's demand for a tenant to make a repair to a building must be justifiable. For example, it can't require a tenant to replace sliding patio doors, for example, or a lift mechanism, if all that is required is a redecoration of the sliding patio doors or the replacement of a lift motor. It's got to be a justifiable expense. Now, it's all very well having a schedule of condition. The repairing liability is limited. Let's say we've excluded repairing liability for repairs to the roof, the lift shaft, the air conditioning units. It's old. Who is responsible? The landlord might well say, fine, you've excluded all this liability, but I'm not under any obligation to do it. So if you have negotiated a schedule of dilapidations as a tenant, you do need to give consideration as to whether or not the landlord should be under a positive obligation to carry out repairs. There are other provisions in the lease which prevent a landlord from interrupting a tenant's business, not letting it continue. But believe me, there's a wealth of difference in enforcing that as a tenant and putting up with a constant drip through windows in the middle of November because there's no one responsible for making repairs to the window frames. What happens when the lease is assigned or it's surrendered? What happens to the repairing liability? Well, it goes to the tenant. The repairing liability sits with the lease. So if you've taken your lease of 5 years and in year 3 your business is going so well, you assign the lease to somebody else, and you transfer it, the incoming tenant will take on the same liability as you did at the start of the lease. So if there's a schedule of condition there limiting liability, that will go with the lease. If it's a full repairing liability and there's no restriction, doesn't matter that you're only in there for 2 years, you inherit the previous 3 years worth of repairs, maybe the last 20 years worth of repairs if predecessing tenants haven't carried out any repairs at all. Which does lead us quite nicely on to what happens when the lease ends? Is it surrendered, or it may be come to end naturally? What happens to the repairing liability? And that is what my colleague Toby Walker is going to be talking to you about when it comes to dealing with dilapidations itself. Toby, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Nice to see you all online as well. And before I start my dilapidations pub quiz, which I know everyone's very excited about, I just want to pick up on this slide because sometimes I think it's good for lawyers to share horror stories. And when it comes to dilapidations, I have a particular horror story, and it's actually to do with this slide about an assignment of a lease. And I had years and years ago a client who came to me saying that he was in difficulty paying his rent, all these huge problems. The landlord was getting very shirty. Anyway, we arranged a meeting and he turned up to the meeting and said, right, Mr. Walker, don't worry. We probably don't even need to speak because it's all sorted. It's all sorted, he said. I said, right, okay, well done. How did you sort it? He said, right, I've assigned the lease to someone else. I was like, okay, right. I'm very happy very quickly with a lawyer. No lawyers to keep the cost down. I've assigned the lease. It's not my problem anymore. I said, right, okay. Turned out that he didn't actually have the landlord's consent to assign, and that this new person had come in and taken occupation of the premises. But the bigger problem was that he hadn't dealt with his dilapidations obligations, and actually that was the big factor that the landlord came after him then for a six-figure sum of dilapidations that he hadn't sorted out in his assignment of his lease. So it was a big, horrible mess. And the point of the story is, remember dilapidations when you're doing an assignment and when you're wrapping everything up to move on. The first thing I'm going to say about is this: a lease is a curious beast. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, it's a contract. But it's a bit of a different contract because it's got this other element to it. And if you think about real property, bricks, mortar, land, it doesn't have that, but it has this weird thing called the term of years. And the term of years element that you're giving to someone, the ability to occupy premises for a period of time makes it different from a contract. And we've got to remember that when we're looking at dilapidations, which essentially is breach of contract. But you have this very nebulous concept of a term of years, which means that you can get some counterintuitive answers to these questions, which I'm going to walk through now. So, first question: tenant enters into a tenancy, but there is no written agreement. Is the tenant, and I've denoted T for tenant, LL for landlord, are they responsible for the following? Taking proper care of the place. If going away for the winter, turn off the water and empty the boiler, clean the chimneys where necessary and also the windows, mend the electric light when it fuses, unstop the sink when it's blocked by its waste, other little jobs around the place, and repair the house if it falls into disrepair through wear and tear or lapse of time. You might think that's a curious list, and you might be thinking, well, no, if there's no written agreement, why would the tenant be responsible for those things? The answer, and we have this on the authority of Lord Denning from a 1954 case of Warren and Keane, is the answer is yes to all of these except for G. So Lord Denning actually lists these things out as the things that would be implied into a tenancy, even if there's no written agreement. So a tenant is responsible for all of these, other than disrepair through wear and tear or lapse of time. And if the landlord wants a tenant to be responsible for that, they would need to draft that into a written agreement. And these obligations, sort of A through to F, are called the implied tenant-like user provisions. So that's the position if you've got no written agreement. Question 2. A tenant is on a periodic tenancy after the term expires. So you've got a fixed term of years, say 10 years, and after that lease comes to an end of the time, the tenant still remains in occupation, continues to pay rent. The question here is the repair obligations that were in this written lease that was due to end at a certain date, do they continue on? And the answer is very probably yes, because really the contractual position, even after this term of years has ended, is that the tenant is there paying the rent on the same terms and repair obligation carry over. It's almost like copied and pasted. That's what the position continues. So question 3. A landlord shows a prospective tenant around premises and says, if you take the lease, I'll do this, that, the other. And then a lease is drawn up, but there is no mention of those repair obligations that the landlord had said and promised he would do. And the question is the landlord bound? And when I first started thinking about this question, I thought no, because if it's not in the lease, that's their contract, end of. However, the case of De La Salle and Guildford from 1901, so a good 120 years ago, says that in that exact situation, what has happened is that the landlord and tenant have formed a collateral contract, which I like that phrase because it makes you sound clever. A collateral contract. Collateral contract exists. And that is separate to the lease, but it has all the contractual principles. You've got an offer from the landlord. If you take a contract, I'll do this. And therefore, there's consideration moving from both sides, and it's a contract separate to the lease. So the tenant can hold the landlords to that. I'd also say, if I was acting for the tenant, consider a claim for misrepresentation, because the landlord said things, you've entered into the contract, and then they're now going back on what they've said.
How would you prove those things on this default?
Yeah, that's yeah. It's very nice from our ivory tower and sort of law books to say that this is a position. Proving it in court is a completely different thing altogether, and absolutely you might run into problems, especially if the landlord's denying they have said that. Good question. And if I was acting for the landlord, I would say, well, consider a boilerplate clause in your lease saying that the parties enter into this have placing no reliance on things said other than the terms of this lease, and you might be able to get around it that way. Okay, question number 4. Towards the end of the well drafted by Nick Morrison or ending lease, the landlord says, when talking about repairs, don't worry about it. You're free to go, on you go. And is the landlord bound by that statement? Can the landlord then come back and say, oh, actually, here's a terminal schedule of dilapidations? And I think the answer to that is, I don't think the landlord would be bound. Because it is just a bare promise, it's not contractually binding, and the terms of the lease would prevail. However, same situation, but this time, the landlord says, don't worry about the repairs, and the tenant responds saying, great, I think I will buy that new Tesla truck for my business after all, using money that they've put aside to deal with the repairs. Is the landlord bound? And I would say possibly yes, because the tenant has changed their position on the basis of something the landlord has said. And you, rather than a contract claim, you could try and hold the landlord to their word by way of an argument called estoppel. So if the landlord makes a clear representation, the tenant relies on that reasonably, to their detriment, actually paying out the new Tesla truck, then the court could step in to say it's unconscionable for the landlord to now go back on that. And this is a similar argument to when banks accidentally pay their employees twice. The banks can claim back by a mistake. But if the employee has changed their position and said, well, actually, I was told I'd be getting an extra bonus by my boss, maybe they have an argument in estoppel. I quite like that because I like all things to do with estoppel. Now, question 5. No? I think I missed one. I missed Charlotte's. Never mind. Can the landlord sue a tenant for breach of repair obligations after the following events. A tenant leaves under a break notice. So the lease allows a tenant to say, right, well, I'm not going to complete the whole term. I'm entitled to serve a break notice and end the lease early. Or when the lease is forfeit for non-payment of rent. Forfeiture is when the landlord brings the lease to an end, either by re-entry premises, changing the locks because of non-payment of rent, or goes to court for an order for forfeiture because of the tenant's breach, and that brings the lease to an early end. Or third scenario, the lease is surrendered by handing back the keys. So an agreed, yeah, I'm handing up the premises back to you, and the landlord says, yes, okay, I accept that, the lease is at an end. So can the landlord sue tenant for breach of repair obligations after those things? And the answer is yes to all three. With the caveat, tenant is responsible for all breaches of the repair obligations during the lifetime of the lease. What the landlord can't sue is for anything that takes place after the end of the lease. So basically, in all these situations, the contract is at an end, but the tenant is held to their obligations before it comes to an end. Okay, this is a knotty one, and you're just getting an opinion, not a clear yes or no from me, I'm afraid. A tenant's lease contains covenants to yield up the premises in good repair at the end of a term. So they stay in occupation, it's say a 10-year lease, but then at the end they hold over. So under their statutory right for a new lease, they continue to pay the rent even though the fixed term of the lease has ended under the 1954 Act. Question is, they're holding over, but do the repair obligations that are due to kick in at the end of the term apply now, or the new lease that the court will grant under the Act? I've been back and forth on this one. I don't know whether Nick and Aileen have a different view, but I think probably yes is my answer, because the contract says at the end of the term, and the end of the term is exactly what it is. It's when the time runs out. And even though the court's going to grant a new lease, that will be from a new date, and therefore the term finishes, and on a contractual kind of construction viewpoint, that term has ended, and therefore a landlord could serve a terminal schedule even though the tenant's still in. However, what I would say is that it's better to put it in your lease and be absolutely clear in that scenario whether the landlord is entitled to serve a terminal schedule, because obviously that's the big whammy at the end in terms of all the repair obligations kind of coming into to be paid up on. And the other reality is that in this scenario, when a tenant or a landlord applies to court for a new lease, I don't think I've ever seen one of these cases actually get to trial, because usually through the help of surveyors and lawyers, new terms of a new lease are agreed upon without the court having to decide it. Courts don't like deciding these things. Courts want the parties to agree terms between each other, and they want surveyors to tell them what an appropriate rent is. So it's a very rare situation for a court to have to decide what the terms of a new lease should be. So in reality, this is an academic question that's usually dealt with by corporations saying, right, well, how about we do these bits of works, and then you grant us a new lease with a slightly less onerous repair obligation. It's dealt with by way of negotiation. Right. A tenant's lease. Oh, this is a really important question, this one. A tenant's lease comes to an end. Landlord demands £75 for costs of repair. I think you can assume that the landlord has obtained quotes for these repairs, and they're coming at £75. However, the landlord only does £45 worth of the works and alters or demolishes the rest before granting a new lease of the premises to a new tenant. The diminution in value of the premises due to the tenant's disrepair was £35. What is the landlord's claim against the tenant? Now, the reason I've used these figures will become clear in a moment, but the common law answer, so for years, how the courts have dealt with it, is that the answer is this: regardless of whether the landlord does the works or not. It's the cost of the repairs, because for breach of contract, it's the cost to put the landlord back in the position had the tenant performed the contract, i.e. done the repairs. So the common law position is £75. However, that principle that the common law damages is the reasonable cost of the work is from a case of Joyner and Weeks, which is again probably over 100 years old. But the position as of 1927, when the Landlord and Tenant Act came in, is that the answer is £35. And this is a really important principle when thinking about dilapidations, is that Section 18 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927 states that the amount of common law damages shall not exceed the diminution in the value of the reversion. So, even though it would cost £75 to put everything right and do what the tenant should have done, if a surveyor comes along and says, yes, but even with this repair, that place is only worth £35 less, then that becomes a statutory cap on what the landlord can recover. And this is played out in dilapidations litigation, where a landlord says, right, we've got £500,000 worth of dilapidations to put this commercial premises back to where it should be. And the defendant's surveyor comes in and says, yeah, well, I don't disagree with any of your quotes. However, the value of the place is only £100,000 less than what it would be if all the work is done. And that is a good defence to the claim. And they say, well, regardless of the repairs, all we're paying is £100,000. And that can put landlords in a sticky situation, because they need to do repairs if they're going to let it out to a future tenant, but they've got this statutory cap. Okay, almost coming into land. These are all from actual cases, by the way. Landlord claims costs of a new, sparkly, self-sealing aluminium door at a price of £750 to replace an old, defective wooden door, which is only worth £25. Can the landlord claim for the full price of the new door? Aileen shaking her head.
No.
You'd think not, wouldn't you? Because it's betterment.
But
However, and this doesn't necessarily apply in every single case, but it is possible that this scenario could be justifiable by the landlord if the available new aluminium door is the way of dealing with the tenant's breach of lease. So it all depends on the wording of the lease, but it's quite possible that the wording of the lease requires the tenants to deal with the door in a way that the landlord could say, well, the only way of repairing this is to get this new self-sealing door, and that might be for a variety of reasons. Technology might have changed. It might be a very particular wooden door that you can't get anymore. Now, there is an old case on this that I haven't read. I've read a summary of, to do with an old mill. And by the time the lease came to an end and the tenant was due to deal with the repairing obligations, firstly, the tenant couldn't replace this old mill because, you know, there aren't people that can do that. And it had a curious outcome whereby the landlord said, well, I'm going to have to do this instead. So it might be a rare situation, and I'm glad that you're alive to the betterment idea, but it is possible that a landlord can expend a lot more money to fix, to put right the repairing obligation and claim back from the tenant. The case is Harbert's Plasticine Limited against Wayne Tank and Pump Co Limited. I can send you the case if you like.
I thought the visitors was always replacing like with like.
Yes, well, and that's what a tenant will argue. I think what this comes down to is the wording of the lease and what is required to comply with the particular obligation, and I suppose it will deal with condition as well. But you might have a situation where it's almost impossible to do like with like. For example, it's just not available anymore. And the landlord might say, well, it's not available to me either. But to otherwise deal with it, I'm going to have to do this, which is more expensive. Okay, right. The remedies available to the landlord in the event of a breach by the tenant of his repairing obligations during the term are as follows. Remembering that if during the term there's a repair obligation, the landlord can inspect and then serve a notice and say, this is broken, you need to fix it. What can the landlord do? Well, possibly forfeiture, which might seem quite a draconian, disproportionate measure, depending on the seriousness of the breach, I suppose, but bring the at least to an end by forfeiture. Damages, which is basically money, cost of putting those repairs right, but converted into cash. Entering and carrying out remedial works themselves, and then seeking that cost back from the tenant. And then specific performance, which I have to say, so far, I don't think I've seen any case for contractual, whether it's to do with property or otherwise, specific performance. It's very rare for people to say, go to court and say, I want an order that this person carries out their contract. But it is technically available. Question is, which of these are available after the term comes to the end? And the answer to that's quite simple. It's just damages. All of the other rights fall away for the landlord, and you just convert everything into money, cash. Right, last question. And there's no really correct order for this, but if the landlord wants to bring a claim for dilapidations, in which order should the following be done? What I have said is I've put follow dilapidations protocol first. Really, I think the most important thing is that you're aware that it exists, because if you do go through the litigation process, you'll be expected as a landlord and indeed as a tenant to have complied with the protocol. And it's like lots of other litigation protocols, it's just the court's expectations of what should happen, which is actually covered by these other things here. Secondly, although this might be your first one, is a surveyor to inspect and report. And no matter how knowledgeable your property lawyer is, or even your litigation lawyer, really these cases come down to the knowledge and experience of a decent surveyor. And at the heart of your dilapidations case as a landlord or a tenant, I suppose, actually, is going to be that report on what has been breached. What does the lease say? What's been breached, and what's the cost of putting it right? And the courts will look to surveyors to resolve these issues. And if there's a dispute, it will look to both surveyors, and then it will ask the surveyors to give their reasons and back up. And at the end of the day, a judge is going to decide which surveyor they find more convincing, what arguments work better. So knowing a good surveyor is really key. Equally, if you're a landlord, to recover the maximum amount, and if you're a tenant, to try and get that liability down. So the surveyor inspects and produces a report. Then you serve your terminal schedules, the terminal being the end of the lease, all drafted by a surveyor. The lawyers wouldn't do this, but it would say, here's your terminal schedule, here are here are the release terms, and say what you're supposed to do. Here's where you're in breach, photographs, descriptions, and here's the cost of putting it right. You also send a quantified demand, which is setting out a table of what costs you're claiming for the works, separating out VAT on those works, and the professional fees of your surveyor and your lawyer. And you put that in your quantified demand, you send it with a schedule, and you tell the tenant to comply with the protocol and give their response within 56 days. Then there ought to be a meeting of experts and surveyors on site to walk around and see what can be agreed. And if there's a particular area of disagreement, the surveyors can have a chat, usually quite civil people. But I have known things almost to get to fisticuffs between disagreeing surveyors. Should be quite fun to watch. Negotiation. that really can take place and should take place throughout the whole process. If you want to save on your professional costs and your surveyor does a quick look round and says, well, I think this is coming in at about £30,000, you might think, well, why don't I save the cost of doing the report, save the lawyer's fees, and have a friendly chat with the tenant and say, look, my guy's saying £30,000, can we do a deal, and deal with it that way? Nothing to stop you doing that. And then issuing the court, and I've just put in there that you can bring claims to the county court, but there are, since the property and business courts relatively recently came into being, which is just a way that the High Court organises itself. There is a property and business court, and these claims dilapidations are usually brought in a subsection of that, which is the technology and construction court, where you're likely to have a judge who knows their way around the commercial lease and deals with things like with dilapidations. So that's the pub quiz. Well done for surviving it. I am going to say any questions, but I expect there will be a panel to answer.
I've got a question, which is one I'm slightly embarrassed to ask, because it's a question I don't always know the answer to. It's mainly one I direct the client to its accountant. But let's assume that you've agreed £50,000 of a dilapidation award. So the tenant's paying the landlord £50,000. First of all, what happens to the VAT? And secondly, how is it treated by the landlord? Is it income or is it compensation, in which case not taxable by corporation tax or income tax?
Okay, well, I've got a bit of a note on this, might not be a comprehensive answer. The landlord will be able to recover any VAT which it incurs in relation to the repair, and which it cannot recover from another paying party, i.e. a tenant, as part of its damages. So you say, right, well, I'm going to do these works, and therefore if I pay this builder this much, I'm going to pay VAT and professional costs and VAT, and you lump that in your claim, including the VAT, and recover that against the tenant. And there's an authority for that, Drummond, the SNU Stores Limited, 1981. However, you cannot recover the VAT where you don't actually do the work, which seems obvious, but again, worth stating, there's another authority for that. But beyond that, I don't know. And I think this is where surveyors can be really useful, because they just do know their way around this. Whereas I like to say that even as property litigation specialists, we are dealing with the packaging, the negotiations, the pointing to the protocol. We can prepare the claim, we can get barristers to represent you at trial, but really these cases come down to stand and fall on the surveyor's evidence and what they say. So just to flag that again, that find a good surveyor.
Thanks for that. I mean, I'm sorry. Okay. I mean, this just one for me. This is as a property solicitor, and again, as
Yeah.
as a commercial landlord myself. To ask as well. On the cap for dilapidations being limited to how much less the property is worth.
Yeah.
How does that work with interim schedules? So if you've got a lease falling in and saying, coming to an end in say 5 years.
Yeah.
You know the tenant's not done much, you know you haven't dealt with it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Does the interim schedule get you around the cap?
I'm going to say, I would put this to a surveyor, but I would have thought that there might be an argument to say that the reversion hasn't come to an end. Whereas the terminal schedule, the reversion has come to an end, it goes back to the landlord.
Yeah.
And then the tenant can say, oh, it's gone back to you, at this value.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more than what you're seeking from me in repairs. An interim schedule, the term of years is continuing. But maybe that is an argument that surveyors do use on services of interim schedule, saying, even though we're in the middle of this, we haven't. So I don't know the answer to that, but I can see it can't be both ways.
The duration of the lease.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I think
Because
it's
it's
the
got
answer, yeah.
they schedule every 6 months, or every year.
It's just a thought, because if you have that position, it would. Something to look at, I think, because logically, you're absolutely right, the cap will apply, but. If you only, it's worth checking whether it does, or whether you could use the exercise you want to.
If
go
it's
in
having a
yourself.
cap, you could, it wouldn't be a cap, it would just
Well,
be people.
You say that, but it's one of those points that it's worth checking, I think.
The other
Just to
thing
make
is,
sure.
is that I wonder whether it depends on what it is, and I don't know because I'm not a commercial landlord. There might be certain things that the landlord is particularly interested in making sure happens during the term.
Mm.
And if there's a particular thing saying we really got to do this, otherwise there's going to be problems later down the line, you could look at an interim schedule and then say to the tenant, well, actually, I'm going to go to court for specific performance that you do this. And then you avoid the argument about the cap. Because you say you've covenanted to do this and that, you haven't done it, you get on and do it, your problem.
But wouldn't the lease have to specify that they have to fix the dilapidations on an ongoing basis during the tenure?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they have to be. I don't know what you
And the
call them.
liability at the end of the lease, you have to fix everything as well.
Yes,
But now you're saying you can have to do it on an ongoing basis.
yes, absolutely. Well, that would depend on the lease wording. So I've been talking mainly about a sort of, the terminal, what you when you yield up the premises back to the landlord, it must be in a good state of repair, reference to a good condition. But this question is more about where the lease provides that the tenants covenants to do things in the duration of the lease, and that might be once a year or something. There might be a redecorating. I don't know. I don't draft leases day to day, but it's where there's an obligation in the middle, in duration, that the landlord could step in, get access to inspect under the terms of the lease, provided you drafted that in, turn up with your surveyor, do a sort of an interim schedule, and then serve that on the tenant and say you need to get this done. And if it's not done, you look at your other remedies in terms of bringing the lease to an end, because it's still in breach of the lease.
The bridge and repair, and the other thing I'm thinking about is UPC. Because I think the tenant can place a window to an absolutely awful job, taking my OPC. Change it that for me. So I could potentially get something on the repair liquidation, because it's not kept in repair. Because the window.
But that was really based on Michael Light, who should come in.
Yeah.
Well,
or not.
depends on what the lease says.
But it's the other bit of that I was thinking. So you can see, Ian, everyone's lines at the moment. change.
It would always be difficult to reduce the EPC by changing them.
I know, you would have thought, but I think.
we'll.
Have we got any questions from our participants from Zoom just before we end? Don't think we do. No, okay. Thank you very much for everyone attending on Zoom. Anything else to add? No? No? Thank you very much.
Look out for details
No,
for the next seminar.
I don't think so. It was just a thank you to everyone for coming. If you have got questions specific to your properties or otherwise, email myself or Toby or Ailey, and we'll do our best to guide you and help you. All I can say is that, as Toby said at the outset, a lease is a very peculiar creature, and there are not many implied terms in it. So if it's not in the lease, then you're fighting a bit of a losing battle, whether you're landlord or tenant. The key to all of these things, when you're drafting a lease, agreeing terms, dealing with dilapidations, talk to the landlord. At the end of the day, it's a relationship, and whether you're at the start of the lease or the end of the lease, if the relationship isn't going to work, then the whole concept of renting the property is probably going to fail as well. There's got to be a willingness from both sides to make things happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One quick question. We talked about the dilapidation.